"Are you here with the catering staff, ma'am?" the young waiter asked as he glanced at the tray in my hands and then at the empty seat beside the ballroom kitchen doors. I smiled politely and told him no, I was the grandmother of the bride. The poor boy looked embarrassed instantly. "Oh my goodness, I'm so sorry," he whispered. But I could already see the confusion in his eyes because nothing about the way my family had treated me that evening suggested I belonged there as family. "I'm glad you're here. Stay with me until the end, and let me know where you're watching from, because what happened at my granddaughter's wedding changed the way I looked at my family forever." The Grand Regency Ballroom in downtown Chicago glowed with golden chandeliers and white roses hanging from crystal arches. Every table had silver candle holders and hand-painted menus tied with satin ribbon. It looked like something out of a bridal magazine, the kind of wedding people talk about for years afterward. And I paid for more of it than anyone in that room knew. I arrived 20 minutes early because I've always believed that important days deserve respect. At 68 years old, I still press my dresses carefully, still polish my own shoes, still show up on time even when nobody else seems to care anymore. I wore a navy blue dress that evening, simple but elegant, with pearl earrings my late husband Richard bought me on our 40th anniversary in Cape Cod. I remember standing in front of the mirror before leaving my condo, touching those earrings gently and hearing his voice in my memory. "You always look classy, Evie." For a moment, I almost felt excited. Chloe was my first grandchild. I held her the day she was born. I sat through elementary school recitals, middle school choir concerts, dance competitions, high school graduation ceremonies. When Daniel and Vanessa were struggling financially years ago, I quietly paid Chloe's private school tuition for nearly 3 years without ever mentioning it to anyone. Richard used to joke that Chloe got her stubborn streak from me. I thought tonight would feel like the reward for all those years loving my family. Instead, I walked into that ballroom and immediately realized I had become invisible. The hostess at the entrance smiled mechanically while checking her seating chart. "Name?" she asked without looking up. "Evelyn Harper," I answered. Her finger moved slowly down the page before her expression tightened slightly. "Ah, yes." She picked up a single card and handed it to me. "Table 19. I looked around the ballroom instinctively. Table 19 sat all the way near the service hallway beside the swinging kitchen doors. Every few seconds, waiters pushed through carrying dirty dishes and empty champagne glasses. The bride's family occupied the center tables near the dance floor under the chandelier light. My son Daniel sat at table 2 beside Vanessa and several wealthy investors from his real estate firm. Chloe's college friends filled tables near the stage. Even distant cousins I barely recognized had better seats than I did. For a second, I honestly thought there had been a mistake. Then I noticed Vanessa across the room. She saw me immediately. Her eyes landed on my table card for half a second before she smiled brightly at another guest and turned away as if she didn't know me at all. That hurt more than if she'd insulted me directly. I made my way through the ballroom carefully, heels sinking slightly into the thick ivory carpet. Conversations softened as I passed. Not because anyone was impressed. More because people were trying to place me. Trying to understand who the older woman walking alone belonged to. At table 19 sat 3 strangers from the catering company during their break, and an elderly man from the groom's side who appeared half asleep already. One chair remained open beside me. I placed my purse carefully underneath the table and folded my hands in my lap. From where I sat, I could barely see the sweetheart table through the floral arrangements. But I could see Vanessa perfectly. My daughter-in-law moved through the ballroom like she owned every inch of it, smiling for photographers, air-kissing guests, adjusting Chloe's train whenever cameras appeared nearby. Vanessa had always understood appearances better than anyone I'd ever met. She knew how to make cruelty look elegant. A few minutes later, Daniel walked past my table with 2 businessmen beside him. For one hopeful second, I thought he might stop. Maybe hug me. Maybe apologize for the seating mistake. Instead, he simply nodded once in my direction like I was an acquaintance from church. "Mom," he said quickly before continuing his conversation without slowing down. I watched him disappear into the crowd and suddenly felt very old. Not weak. Not fragile. Just old in the way you feel when you realize memories matter more to you than to anyone else. The wedding planner tapped her microphone near the stage, announcing that dinner service would begin shortly. Soft piano music floated across the ballroom, while guests settled into their seats laughing and sipping wine. I looked down at the place setting in front of me and noticed something strange. Every table centerpiece had small gold plaques with family titles written in elegant script. Bride's family, groom's family, college friends, business partners. Our table had no plaque at all. Just a plain number 19 standing alone beside the candles. I stared at it for several seconds before finally understanding. This wasn't an accident. Somebody had deliberately decided where I belonged tonight. And for the first time in my life, sitting beside the kitchen doors while strangers celebrated under crystal lights, I began to wonder if my family had been ashamed of me for much longer than I realized. The first course arrived 20 minutes later on oversized white plates that looked more expensive than the food itself. Herb-crusted chicken, roasted fingerling potatoes, and asparagus lined up so carefully it barely looked real. The waiters moved gracefully between tables while soft jazz floated through the ballroom. But from table 19 all I could really hear was the constant swing of the kitchen doors behind me. Metal trays clattered. Someone dropped silverware. Every few minutes a burst of steam and noise spilled into the room before disappearing again. Nobody else in the family seemed to notice. They were too busy laughing under the chandeliers. I picked up my water glass slowly and watched Chloe from across the room. She looked beautiful in her satin gown, smiling beneath the candlelight while photographers circled her endlessly. For a moment, I remembered another night almost 25 years earlier when she was 6 years old and sleeping on my couch because Daniel and Vanessa had spent the evening fighting about money. Chloe had curled against my chest wearing pink pajamas with little snowflakes on them. "Grandma," she whispered that night, "if Daddy loses the house, can we live with you forever?" I had kissed her forehead and told her she would always have a home with me. Back then, she used to run into my arms every Sunday after church. She used to beg me to make blueberry pancakes shaped like Mickey Mouse. I still remembered the gap between her front teeth before braces. Funny how memories stay vivid for one person while everyone else moves on like they never happened at all. A young woman seated at the neighboring table leaned toward me politely. "Are you from the bride's side or the groom's side?" she asked. I smiled softly. "I am Chloe's grandmother." Her eyebrows lifted slightly. "Oh, I thought maybe you were with the venue management." She looked embarrassed the moment the words left her mouth. "I am so sorry. I just meant—" "It is all right," I told her gently. "It has been that kind of evening." She gave me an uncomfortable smile before turning back toward her husband. I looked down at my untouched dinner and suddenly lost my appetite completely. Across the ballroom, Vanessa stood near the stage speaking with the wedding coordinator, while adjusting the diamond bracelet on her wrist. I recognized that bracelet immediately because it used to belong to me. Richard gave it to me for Christmas in 1998 after his architecture firm completed a major downtown project. 2 years ago, Vanessa admired it during Thanksgiving dinner. "Vintage jewelry is coming back," she said casually while holding my wrist beneath the dining room lights. 3 weeks later, Daniel called asking whether Vanessa could borrow it for a charity gala. I never saw it returned. At the time, I convinced myself it did not matter. Families share things. Families help each other. That was how Richard and I raised our son. We believed generosity always came back in love eventually. Looking around that ballroom, I realized how wrong we had been. The master of ceremonies tapped his microphone, asking everyone to direct their attention toward the dance floor for speeches. Conversations softened instantly. Glasses clinked. Guests turned toward table 2 where Daniel stood adjusting his tuxedo jacket. He looked confident, successful, polished. The same boy who used to cry whenever thunderstorms shook our old house in Evanston. The same little boy who once saved allowance money for 6 months just to buy me a birthday scarf from Sears because he thought the color matched my eyes. I missed that version of my son more than I could explain. Daniel raised his champagne glass and smiled proudly at Chloe. "My daughter has always deserved the very best," he began. "Tonight would not have been possible without the incredible support of our family and closest friends." I waited quietly. Surely he would mention Richard. Or me. Richard spent years building the investment accounts that paid for Daniel's education and first home. I covered nearly $40,000 of wedding expenses after Daniel's business suffered losses last winter. I wired the final payment for this ballroom only 12 days earlier. Yet Daniel thanked business partners. He thanked Vanessa's cousins from Scottsdale. He thanked investors from Miami and old fraternity brothers from Northwestern. Then he sat down without saying my name once. Nobody noticed except me. That was the strange thing about humiliation. It often happened quietly. No shouting. No dramatic confrontation. Just the slow realization that the people you loved no longer saw you as important enough to acknowledge publicly. I folded my napkin carefully onto the table and glanced toward the family photo area near the floral wall. Another photographer was arranging relatives for pictures. Vanessa stood at the center giving instructions while Chloe laughed beside her bridesmaids. Immediate family only, I heard Vanessa say. Immediate family. The words settled heavily in my chest. I watched as cousins, in-laws, and even business associates stepped into photographs while nobody once looked in my direction. Not Chloe. Not Daniel. Not even the wedding planner who had personally called me 6 times about payment confirmations during the previous month. I sat there quietly while camera flashes lit up the ballroom like tiny bursts of lightning. Somewhere behind me a dishwasher crashed loudly in the kitchen. The waiter from earlier approached my table again carrying a fresh basket of bread. He leaned closer and lowered his voice slightly. "Ma'am," he said gently, "would you like me to ask if you want to join the family photos?" I stared at him for a second, surprised by the kindness in his eyes. Then I smiled the same tired smile I had worn all evening. "No," I answered softly. "If they wanted me there, they would have asked already." The dance floor slowly filled as the band shifted into softer music and servers cleared dinner plates one by one. I remained seated at table 19 holding the same untouched glass of champagne for nearly 20 minutes. Tiny bubbles had stopped rising long ago. From where I sat, the entire wedding looked beautiful in the kind of distant way expensive department store windows look beautiful during Christmas. Perfect lighting. Perfect smiles. Perfect people pretending their lives had never known disappointment. Vanessa had always loved creating that kind of illusion. I watched her glide across the ballroom greeting guests with polished warmth while photographers followed behind her constantly. She touched elbows lightly when she laughed, tilted her head at exactly the right angle when cameras appeared. Even her tears during Chloe's ceremony had looked elegant somehow. People like Vanessa understood something the rest of us often learned too late. Appearances mattered more to certain people than truth ever would. A waiter approached carrying a silver tray filled with miniature desserts. Chocolate mousse cups, lemon tarts, tiny cheesecakes topped with raspberries. He paused beside my chair politely. "Would you like one, ma'am?" I thanked him and chose a small lemon tart mostly so he would not feel awkward standing there. As he walked away, I overheard laughter coming from behind the floral partition separating the ballroom from the hallway leading toward the bridal suites. Vanessa's voice carried clearly above the others. "Honestly, I could not put her near the front tables," she said with a soft laugh. "She does not exactly fit the image we were going for tonight." Another woman chuckled quietly. "Still, she helped financially, right?" Vanessa lowered her voice slightly, but not enough. "Please. Daniel exaggerates that because he feels guilty. Most of her money came from Richard anyway. Besides, if people knew she was family, they would start asking questions about why she lives alone in a condo at her age." The women laughed again. Not loudly. Not cruelly in the dramatic way movies portray villains. Just comfortably. Casually. Like discussing bad weather or airline delays. I sat completely still while those words settled over me slowly. She does not fit the image. I stared down at the lemon tart in my hand and suddenly remembered the first time Vanessa came to dinner nearly 28 years ago. She was 23 then. Nervous. Beautiful. Wearing a cream sweater with sleeves too long for her wrists. Daniel brought her to our house in Evanston on a rainy October evening. I made pot roast because Daniel always loved it growing up. Vanessa complimented my table settings and offered to help wash dishes afterward. Before they left that night, she hugged me tightly and whispered, "I never had a close family before. This feels so warm." I believed her completely. Richard believed her too. We welcomed her without hesitation because that is what families are supposed to do. Looking back now, I wondered whether she had been studying us even then. Learning what mattered to us. Learning how to become exactly what Daniel wanted. The band announced the father-daughter dance, pulling me back into the present. Chloe stepped onto the dance floor beside Daniel while guests gathered around smiling. The opening piano notes hit me immediately because it was the same song Richard and Chloe used to dance to in our living room every Christmas Eve when she was little. Moon River. Richard would spin her carefully while she stood on top of his shoes laughing so hard she could barely breathe. Tears stung my eyes unexpectedly, not because I felt excluded anymore. That feeling had already gone numb. What hurt was realizing Richard had been gone only 4 years, and somehow his entire presence had already disappeared from this family. Nobody mentioned him during speeches. No photographs displayed him near the memory table except one small frame beside the guest book. Even Chloe danced to his favorite song without acknowledging where the tradition came from. It was as though the family Vanessa wanted to present tonight had been carefully edited into something cleaner and more convenient. Something polished enough for wealthy guests and business connections. I looked around slowly and noticed something else for the first time. Every centerpiece in the ballroom featured white roses except mine. Table 19 had pale artificial hydrangeas instead. Cheap ones. One flower had already bent sideways where glue showed beneath the petals. Such a tiny detail. Yet somehow it told me everything. Someone had planned every layer of separation carefully. Not openly enough to create confrontation. Just enough to remind me where I belonged now. Near the kitchen doors. Away from the photographs. Away from the future they were building. "Evelyn?" a familiar voice said gently beside me. I looked up startled to find Grace Bennett standing there holding a champagne glass. Richard's oldest friend. Her silver coat shimmered softly beneath the ballroom lights. "Grace," I whispered, genuinely relieved for the first time all evening. She studied my face carefully before sitting beside me without asking permission. "I have been looking for you everywhere," she said quietly. Then her eyes moved toward the center tables and hardened slightly. "Although now I understand why I could not find you." I tried to smile. "Apparently this is where they keep the unwanted relatives." Grace did not laugh. Instead she placed her hand gently over mine. Richard would never have allowed this. His name hit me harder than expected. I swallowed carefully and looked away toward the dance floor where Daniel kissed Chloe's forehead, while cameras flashed around them. "No," I answered softly. "He would not have." Grace remained silent for a moment before reaching into her evening purse slowly. "There is something I need to give you," she said in a lower voice. "Martin Keller asked me to make sure it reached you personally tonight." My stomach tightened slightly as she removed a sealed ivory envelope with Richard's handwriting across the front. I recognized those careful blue ink letters immediately even after 4 years. "For Evelyn. Only if necessary." For several seconds I could not breathe properly. The envelope rested quietly in Grace's hands while the music and laughter around us continued as though nothing important had happened. But everything inside me had shifted the moment I saw Richard's handwriting again. My husband had been gone for 4 years, yet suddenly he felt close enough to touch. I reached for the envelope carefully, almost afraid the ink itself might disappear beneath my fingers. The paper felt thick and expensive, the kind Richard always preferred for personal correspondence. He believed details mattered. "What is this?" I asked softly. Grace glanced toward the dance floor before answering. "Richard gave it to Martin 6 months before he passed away," she said quietly. "He told him to release it only under very specific circumstances." My chest tightened. "What circumstances?" Grace hesitated just long enough to tell me the answer mattered more than I wanted it to. "If your family ever treated you like an embarrassment." I looked away immediately because tears threatened to rise too quickly. Richard knew. Somehow my husband had seen something years before I did. The realization unsettled me deeply because Richard was never dramatic or suspicious by nature. He spent 40 years designing buildings across Chicago with the patience of a man who trusted structure and logic more than emotion. If he prepared something like this, he must have had a reason. I stared down at the envelope resting in my lap while memories began surfacing one after another. Small moments I had ignored at the time because love makes excuses long after respect has disappeared. 3 summers ago, Daniel canceled our annual family trip to Lake Geneva 2 days before departure. Vanessa claimed Chloe needed space from family obligations before college applications. Later I saw photographs online of them vacationing in Napa Valley with Vanessa's relatives instead. At Thanksgiving the following year, Vanessa insisted on hosting dinner herself for the first time. She assigned me a folding chair near the hallway because she said the dining table was too crowded. I remember balancing a paper plate on my lap while strangers occupied the seats where Richard and I used to host 20 people comfortably every Christmas. Last Easter, Chloe barely spoke to me for more than 5 minutes before Vanessa redirected her toward guests from Daniel's office. Networking matters nowadays, she whispered with a smile that sounded polite but felt sharp somehow. I had spent years convincing myself these things were misunderstandings. Generational differences, busy schedules, modern families changing with time. Sitting there now beside the kitchen doors while holding Richard's final letter, I realized the truth was much simpler and far more painful. They had been slowly moving me out of the picture for years. Grace watched my expression carefully. "He noticed things before you did," she said gently. "Richard worried about Vanessa almost from the beginning." I frowned slightly. "Why did he never tell me?" "Because he loved Daniel," Grace answered softly. "And because he hoped he was wrong." The band transitioned into faster music while guests applauded near the dance floor. Somewhere behind us, champagne glasses shattered briefly before staff hurried to clean the mess. The wedding continued in perfect rhythm around me, but suddenly it felt distant, like I was watching another family entirely. "There is more," Grace added quietly. "Martin wanted to come personally tonight, but there were legal complications involving the trust paperwork. He said if you opened the envelope, you should call him afterward immediately." The word trust landed heavily in my mind. Richard handled most financial matters during our marriage because numbers bored me terribly. I trusted him completely. Even after his death, Martin Keller managed the estate according to Richard's instructions. Daniel always assumed whatever remained would eventually become his anyway. I had assumed the same. That was how families worked. Parents built stability so their children could live easier lives. Yet something in Grace's expression told me Richard may have changed those expectations long ago. I turned the envelope over slowly. The seal remained unbroken. "For Evelyn. Only if necessary." Such a simple sentence. Yet Richard's voice echoed clearly through every word. Calm, precise, thoughtful. I suddenly remembered a conversation we had shortly before his final hospital stay. We were sitting on the condo balcony overlooking Lake Michigan while snow drifted softly across the water. Richard looked unusually quiet that evening. "Promise me something," he said out of nowhere. "Do not spend the rest of your life apologizing for growing older." I laughed at the time because the comment felt random. "Who says I do that?" He smiled sadly without answering immediately. "You make yourself smaller whenever people treat you like you are inconvenient. Especially Daniel." I dismissed it back then. Mothers protect their children instinctively, even adult ones. But Richard saw patterns I refused to acknowledge. He saw how often Daniel let Vanessa speak for him. How quickly invitations became obligations instead of affection. How family gatherings slowly shifted away from warmth and toward presentation. "You know what the saddest part is?" I whispered finally while staring across the ballroom. Grace squeezed my hand gently. "What?" I watched Chloe pose for photographs beside Vanessa, while Daniel checked messages on his phone between conversations with investors. None of them had looked toward me in nearly 40 minutes. "I think I kept loving the version of my family that existed 10 years ago," I said quietly. "And I never noticed they stopped loving me back." Grace's eyes softened with something close to heartbreak. Before she could answer, a voice interrupted from behind us. "Mom!" Daniel stood beside the table adjusting his cufflinks impatiently. "There you are. Vanessa has been wondering why you disappeared from the reception area." I looked up at my son slowly, still holding Richard's sealed envelope in both hands. Daniel loosened his expression into what was probably meant to look like concern, but I knew my son well enough to recognize discomfort when I saw it. He kept glancing toward the center of the ballroom where Vanessa stood speaking with guests near the wedding cake display. Even now, standing in front of me after nearly an hour of ignoring my existence, part of his attention remained fixed on whether his wife approved of the conversation. "We thought maybe you stepped outside," he said casually. "Vanessa has been trying to keep everything organized tonight." Grace shifted slightly beside me but stayed silent. Daniel's eyes landed briefly on the envelope in my hands. "What is that?" he asked. I looked down at Richard's handwriting before answering calmly. Something your father left for me. Daniel nodded without much interest. Oh. Then, almost immediately, his focus drifted back toward the ballroom again. Well, they are about to start the slideshow presentation. Chloe wanted family members closer to the front during that part. The sentence hung between us strangely because we both knew he was offering too little too late. For a moment I considered reminding him where they had seated me all evening. I considered asking why complete strangers occupied better tables than his own mother. I considered telling him what I overheard Vanessa say behind the floral wall. But exhaustion settled over me heavier than anger. After a certain age, disappointment no longer arrives like a storm. It arrives quietly. Like recognizing a place you used to call home no longer belongs to you. I am comfortable here, I answered softly. Daniel looked relieved instantly. Good. Good. Then he smiled awkwardly at Grace. Nice seeing you again, Grace. Daniel, she replied coolly. My son adjusted his jacket once more before lowering his voice slightly. Mom, one more thing. Vanessa asked whether you could avoid mentioning financial contributions tonight if people ask questions. Some of her relatives are sensitive about money conversations. I stared at him in silence for several seconds because I honestly thought I misheard him. Financial contributions? I repeated quietly. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck impatiently. You know what I mean. We just want Chloe's wedding to feel balanced. Not transactional. Balanced. The word echoed in my mind strangely. I thought about the $40,000 I wired without hesitation when Daniel called me crying 3 months earlier because venue costs had spiraled beyond their budget. I remembered liquidating part of Richard's retirement account because Daniel promised he would repay me after several commercial properties sold. I remembered sitting alone at my kitchen table signing transfer documents while convincing myself family always came before pride. And now my son stood in front of me asking me to pretend none of it happened because acknowledging my help might embarrass his wife's relatives. Of course, I said finally. My voice sounded calmer than I felt. Daniel smiled quickly. Thank you, Mom. I knew you would understand. Then he hurried away before I could say anything else. Grace watched him disappear into the crowd with visible disbelief. My God, she whispered softly. He really does not see it. I looked down at the envelope again. No, I answered quietly. I do not think he does. Across the ballroom the lights dimmed slightly as a large projection screen lowered near the dance floor. Guests applauded while servers refilled champagne glasses. The slideshow began with childhood photographs of Chloe growing up through the years. Pictures flashed across the screen every few seconds while sentimental piano music played overhead. Chloe riding a bicycle at age 7. Chloe at summer camp. Chloe during high school graduation. I smiled despite everything because seeing her little face again softened something painful inside me. Then another realization slowly settled in. Every photograph featuring Richard or me had been cropped carefully. In one image from Christmas morning, only Chloe and Daniel remained visible, though I remembered standing beside them holding presents. In another beach photograph from Cape Cod, Richard's arm appeared barely at the edge before disappearing outside the frame. Even our family history had been edited tonight. Grace noticed it too. That cannot be accidental, she murmured. I said nothing because deep down I already knew it was not. Vanessa understood image control too perfectly for accidents. The slideshow continued while guests laughed warmly at childhood moments and sentimental memories. Then suddenly the screen displayed a black and white photograph of Richard standing beside Chloe outside Wrigley Field when she was 10 years old. The ballroom softened into quiet appreciation. Richard looked tall and proud in his navy windbreaker, smiling down at his granddaughter with that calm, steady warmth everyone trusted immediately. For the first time all evening, I heard genuine emotion in Chloe's voice as she stood near the microphone. My grandfather taught me what loyalty looked like, she said softly. He always showed up for the people he loved. Tears gathered unexpectedly in my eyes. Around the ballroom guests nodded sympathetically while the next photograph appeared. Richard helping Chloe move into Northwestern University. Richard teaching her how to drive. Richard sitting beside her during a hospital visit after she broke her ankle senior year. Then the screen went dark for a moment before one final sentence appeared in white lettering across the black background. Family is not measured by appearances. It is measured by who remains when appearances no longer matter. The quote belonged to Richard. He used to say it constantly whenever Daniel became too focused on money or status growing up. A strange silence settled over the ballroom after the words disappeared. Even Vanessa looked briefly unsettled near the sweetheart table. Beside me, Grace inhaled slowly. Richard chose that quote personally for the trust documents, she whispered carefully. My fingers tightened instinctively around the sealed envelope. Before I could answer, my phone vibrated quietly inside my purse. I pulled it out slowly and saw a text message from an unknown number. It contained only one sentence. Do not open the envelope alone. Martin Keller is on his way. For the next several minutes I could barely focus on the wedding around me. My phone remained in my lap with that single message glowing against the screen like a warning. I did not fully understand yet. Do not open the envelope alone. Martin Keller is on his way. I read the sentence 3 more times while the ballroom continued buzzing with celebration. Guests laughed near the open bar. Servers carried fresh coffee and tiny dessert plates from table to table. The bride and groom moved slowly through the crowd thanking relatives and posing for photographs. Everything looked normal on the surface. But something beneath that perfect evening had started shifting quietly, and for the first time all night, I no longer felt invisible. Grace leaned closer toward me. What did the message say? She whispered. I showed her the screen silently. Her expression tightened immediately. Then Martin must already know something happened tonight. I glanced toward the ballroom entrance instinctively. What exactly is in this envelope, Grace? She hesitated before answering. Richard never told me details. Only that he changed certain arrangements during the last year of his illness. My chest tightened slightly. During Richard's illness, I suddenly remembered long afternoons sitting beside his hospital bed, while he quietly reviewed paperwork with Martin Keller after chemotherapy appointments. At the time I assumed they were updating wills and insurance forms like most couples our age eventually do. Richard always handled those things privately because he hated burdening me with financial stress. Looking back now, I realized how often Daniel and Vanessa visited during those months only when money discussions were involved. Vanessa especially. She used to arrive carrying expensive coffee drinks and force sympathy, while casually asking questions about Richard's properties downtown. You should really simplify things, she told him once while adjusting flowers near his hospital window. Managing multiple assets at your age must feel exhausting. Richard smiled politely at the time but said very little afterward once she left. Another memory surfaced unexpectedly. About 6 months before Richard passed away, I overheard Vanessa arguing quietly with Daniel in our kitchen after dinner. You are too passive, she snapped under her breath. If your father leaves everything tied up legally, we will spend years waiting. The moment they noticed me entering the room, both immediately changed the subject. I told myself back then they were probably discussing taxes or estate complications. Families often become awkward around illness and money. But now, sitting there with Richard's envelope in my hands, old conversations no longer sounded innocent. Across the ballroom the lights dimmed slightly again as the wedding coordinator announced the cake-cutting ceremony. Guests gathered near the massive 5-tier cake, decorated with white sugar roses and gold trim. Vanessa positioned herself carefully beside Chloe while photographers prepared their cameras. Even from across the room I could see how conscious Vanessa remained about every angle, every image, every impression people carried home afterward. Daniel spotted me briefly near table 19 and motioned half-heartedly toward the crowd as though inviting me closer. But nobody actually came to escort me over. Nobody made space beside the family. So I stayed where I was. The cake cutting began beneath bursts of applause while soft music floated through the ballroom speakers. Chloe laughed as frosting accidentally touched her nose. Daniel wrapped one arm around Vanessa proudly while guests took videos on their phones. Looking at them from a distance felt strangely peaceful now. Earlier that evening I wanted desperately to belong inside those moments again. Now I simply observed them. Like watching strangers perform a play I used to understand. Grace touched my arm gently. Evelyn, she said carefully, whatever Richard arranged, you need to prepare yourself. Martin does not leave his office during private events unless something serious is involved. Before I could answer, movement near the ballroom entrance caught my attention. Martin Keller had arrived. Even from across the room he looked exactly the same as always. Tall. Precise. Gray-haired. Wearing the kind of dark tailored suits that never seemed wrinkled no matter the hour. He paused briefly near the reception desk speaking with venue staff before scanning the ballroom slowly. The moment his eyes found me, his expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Not surprise. Recognition. Concern. He walked toward our table immediately without stopping to greet anyone else. Vanessa noticed him halfway across the ballroom. I saw her smile freeze for just a fraction of a second before she whispered something urgently into Daniel's ear. Daniel turned quickly and his entire posture stiffened the moment he recognized Martin. Interesting, I thought quietly. Very interesting. Martin reached our table and removed his glasses slowly. Evelyn, he said warmly, though tension lingered beneath his voice. I apologize for arriving unannounced. I stood instinctively to hug him lightly. Martin, what is happening? He glanced briefly toward Daniel and Vanessa before answering carefully. I hoped tonight would not require this conversation. My fingers tightened around Richard's envelope. Conversation about what? Martin remained silent for a moment too long. Then he lowered his voice. Richard included conditional clauses within the Harper family trust before his death. The word conditional settled heavily between us. Grace inhaled quietly beside me. Conditional on what? I asked. Martin looked directly into my eyes then. On how you were treated after Richard was gone. My heartbeat slowed strangely instead of speeding up. Somewhere deep inside me, pieces finally started connecting into something painful but clear. Richard knew exactly what might happen once he was no longer there to protect me. Before I could speak again, Vanessa suddenly appeared beside our table wearing her polished smile once more. Martin, she said brightly, though her voice sounded tight underneath. We were not expecting legal business tonight. Martin turned toward her calmly. Neither was I. Daniel stepped beside his wife almost immediately. What is going on? He asked, trying to sound casual but failing badly. Martin adjusted his cufflinks carefully before answering. That depends entirely on whether your father's concerns were justified. Silence spread between the four of us while laughter and music continued all around. Then for the first time all evening, Vanessa stopped looking confident. Vanessa recovered first. She always did. Within seconds her polished smile returned, though tighter around the edges now. I think this may not be the best place for legal discussions, she said lightly while glancing around at nearby guests. Tonight is about Chloe. Martin remained calm. I agree completely. Unfortunately, your father-in-law anticipated that possibility. Daniel frowned immediately. What does that mean? Martin looked toward me before speaking again. Richard Harper amended the family trust 11 months before his passing. Certain conditions were attached regarding Evelyn's care, treatment, and legal protection after his death. The color slowly drained from Daniel's face. Vanessa crossed her arms carefully. Legal protection from what exactly? She asked. Martin did not answer her directly. Instead he extended his hand toward me gently. Evelyn, I believe it is time you open the envelope. The ballroom suddenly felt very quiet despite the music still playing overhead. My hands trembled slightly as I broke the seal carefully along the edge. For a moment I simply stared at Richard's folded letter resting inside. I recognized the deep blue stationery immediately. He used that same stationery every anniversary during our marriage, because he believed handwritten words mattered more than expensive gifts. Slowly I unfolded the paper. Evelyn, if you are reading this, then my greatest fear has already come true. The words blurred briefly through gathering tears. I steadied myself and continued silently while Martin, Grace, Daniel, and Vanessa watched my expression carefully. I know you better than anyone in this world. I know how quickly you forgive people who do not deserve it. I know you make excuses when others treat you carelessly because love has always mattered more to you than pride. But I also know something else. You spent 40 years helping me build everything this family now enjoys. Without you, there would have been no properties, no investments, no trust at all. And if our son ever forgets that after I am gone, then he does not deserve unrestricted access to what we built together. My breathing slowed. Across the ballroom, guests continued laughing near the bar, completely unaware that the foundation beneath Daniel and Vanessa's lives was quietly shifting. I kept reading. Martin has full instructions. The Harper Family Trust was restructured under one condition. Daniel will retain access only if he and his wife continue demonstrating consistent emotional and financial support toward you after my passing. Any documented pattern of humiliation, neglect, coercion, isolation, or exploitation immediately transfers controlling interest solely to you. Vanessa inhaled sharply beside Daniel. I continued reading without looking up. I did not create this condition to punish our son. I created it because I watched him become weaker every year he allowed appearances to matter more than loyalty. And I watched you slowly disappear inside your own family trying to keep peace that nobody else protected for you. If that happens after I am gone, then everything transfers back where it belongs. To you. My vision blurred completely for a second. Richard's final sentence sat alone at the bottom of the page. Never beg to remain where you are only tolerated. Silence settled heavily around our table once I lowered the letter. Even the nearby guests seemed quieter somehow, though perhaps that was only because my entire world sounded different now. Daniel stared at Martin in disbelief. "This is insane," he whispered. "My father would never." "Your father signed the amended trust personally in my office," Martin interrupted calmly, "along with 3 witnesses and full psychiatric evaluation confirming legal competency." Vanessa stepped forward immediately. "There must be some misunderstanding here. Richard adored Daniel." "He did," Martin answered evenly, "which is exactly why he gave him every opportunity to prove worthy of responsibility." Daniel ran both hands through his hair anxiously. "Okay, wait. What exactly counts as humiliation or neglect? Because this sounds incredibly subjective." Martin's expression hardened slightly for the first time all evening. "Your father anticipated that concern as well, which is why specific examples were outlined." He opened a slim leather folder he carried beneath his arm. Repeated exclusion from family functions, financial manipulation, isolation from grandchildren, public disrespect, deliberate social diminishment, attempts to conceal Evelyn's role within family matters for appearance purposes. Vanessa's face lost all remaining color. Daniel looked toward me suddenly, panic replacing irritation. "Mom," he said quickly, "you know we would never intentionally." I met his eyes calmly for the first time all evening. "Would never intentionally what, Daniel?" He opened his mouth but nothing came out immediately. Because the terrible thing about truth is that once spoken clearly, ordinary moments begin sounding very different. Table 19 no longer looked accidental. The cropped family photographs no longer looked harmless. Vanessa's comments behind the floral wall no longer sounded misunderstood. Martin closed the folder carefully. Under the trust provisions, tonight's events triggered immediate review procedures. Vanessa's voice sharpened instantly. "Triggered by who exactly?" Martin looked directly at her. "By multiple witnesses already present at this reception." Grace remained silent beside me, but I suddenly remembered the young waiter offering to include me in family photographs earlier. I remembered the hostess hesitating over my seating assignment. I remembered guests overhearing Vanessa's comments near the hallway. Small humiliations leave traces. Vanessa stepped closer toward Daniel urgently, lowering her voice. "We need to handle this privately now." But Daniel no longer looked at her. He was staring at me instead. Really staring at me for perhaps the first time in years. And slowly, painfully, my son finally began to understand what his father had seen long before either of us did. For several long seconds nobody at our table moved. The music from the ballroom continued softly in the background, while Daniel stared at the trust documents like they belonged to another family entirely. Vanessa's composure had cracked now. Not dramatically. She was too controlled for that. But I noticed the tiny signs immediately. The way her jaw tightened whenever Martin spoke. The nervous tapping of one manicured fingernail against her champagne glass. The fact that she stopped smiling altogether. Around us, the wedding reception carried on under golden chandeliers while guests laughed and danced completely unaware that the Harper Family Trust had just shifted beneath their feet. Daniel finally looked toward Martin again. "How much control are we talking about here?" he asked quietly. Martin answered without hesitation. "As of tonight, pending final review, Evelyn becomes sole controlling trustee over all Harper commercial holdings, investment properties, and long-term family accounts previously scheduled for phase transfer to you. Daniel went pale instantly. Even after everything earlier that evening, hearing the actual scope aloud shocked him. Richard and I had spent decades building those holdings together. 3 apartment buildings in Chicago, commercial retail space in Naperville, investment portfolios, retirement trusts. Daniel always assumed he would inherit management automatically once I passed away. Vanessa swallowed carefully. Pending review, she repeated quickly. So nothing is finalized yet. Martin looked at her calmly. That depends on whether tonight's behavior reflects an isolated misunderstanding or an established pattern. Vanessa stepped closer immediately, lowering her voice into the gentle polished tone she used whenever trying to regain control of a conversation. Martin, surely we can discuss this privately after the wedding. Evelyn knows how much we love and appreciate her. The sentence hung in the air awkwardly because all 4 of us knew exactly how false it sounded after tonight. I remained silent while Daniel rubbed his forehead anxiously. Mom, he said finally, if we made you feel excluded tonight, then I am sorry. Obviously there were seating mistakes and stress and… The seating chart was approved 3 weeks ago. Martin interrupted evenly while checking paperwork inside his folder. Daniel stopped talking immediately. Martin continued calmly. According to venue documentation, Vanessa personally requested table 19 because it was, quote, less visually distracting during family photography. Vanessa's face drained completely. For the first time all evening, she looked genuinely afraid. That is not what I meant, she said quickly. The tables were rearranged several times and… Martin calmly removed another paper from the folder. You also instructed staff not to identify Evelyn publicly as primary financial sponsor of the wedding reception. Daniel slowly turned toward his wife. Vanessa, she stepped toward him immediately. Because your investors were here tonight, she whispered urgently. I was trying to protect appearances. That is all. Protect appearances. The phrase echoed through my mind quietly. Suddenly every moment from the past several years looked painfully clear. The cancelled holidays, the excluded photographs, the smaller invitations, the polite distance. None of it happened by accident. I had become inconvenient to the image they wanted the world to see. Across the ballroom, Chloe noticed the tension near our table and started walking toward us slowly through the crowd. Her white gown shimmered beneath the lights while guests stepped aside to let her pass. For one brief second, seeing her reminded me of the little girl who used to sleep curled beside me during thunderstorms. What is going on? She asked softly once she reached us. Nobody answered immediately. Chloe looked from Daniel to Vanessa to Martin before her eyes finally landed on the documents in my hands. Grandma, she whispered. I looked at her carefully. Unlike her parents, Chloe still seemed genuinely confused. Young enough perhaps to believe family tensions solved themselves quietly behind closed doors. Martin cleared his throat gently. Your grandfather created conditional inheritance protections before his death, he explained carefully. Certain concerns were documented regarding Evelyn's future treatment within the family. Chloe blinked in confusion. Treatment. Then slowly realization spread across her face as she looked around the ballroom. At my isolated table beside the kitchen doors. At Vanessa standing rigid beside Daniel. At the envelope in my hands. Oh my God, she whispered softly. Nobody spoke. Sometimes silence reveals truth more brutally than arguments ever could. Chloe's eyes filled with tears almost immediately. Grandma, she said quietly, why did you not tell me? I smiled sadly because the answer felt embarrassingly simple now. I kept hoping things would feel different next time. Chloe looked devastated. Real devastated. Not embarrassed. Not defensive. Just heartbroken in the honest, uncomplicated way young people still feel before pride hardens everything. She glanced toward table 19 again. You were sitting there the whole night? Before I could answer, Vanessa stepped forward sharply. Chloe, this is not the time for emotional overreaction. Chloe turned toward her mother slowly. You put Grandma beside the kitchen. Vanessa crossed her arms defensively. It was one table assignment. No, Chloe answered quietly. It was not. Her voice shook slightly now. You cropped Grandpa out of the slideshow photos too. Another silence followed. A heavier one this time. Because once somebody finally speaks the truth aloud, everyone else must decide whether to keep pretending. Daniel sank slowly into the empty chair beside me, suddenly looking much older than 60 seconds earlier. He stared across the ballroom where guests danced beneath crystal lights, completely unaware that his father had predicted this exact moment years ago. He knew, Daniel whispered to himself. Dad knew this would happen. I looked down at Richard's letter resting quietly in my lap. Yes, he did. Richard saw what I refused to see because love kept blinding me long after respect disappeared. Martin checked his watch briefly before speaking again. Legally, we can postpone formal proceedings until Monday morning. However, operational control over Harper Holdings transfers immediately tonight, unless Evelyn declines enforcement. Every eye turned toward me then. Daniel's looked desperate. Vanessa's looked terrified. Chloe's looked broken-hearted. And for the first time in years, nobody at that table was treating me like I did not matter. I looked around the ballroom slowly while everyone waited for my answer. The music still played softly near the dance floor, but now conversations had started fading table by table as guests noticed something serious unfolding near the back of the reception hall. People glanced toward us discreetly over champagne glasses and dessert plates. Some pretended not to stare. Others stopped pretending entirely. Funny how quickly people notice the person they ignored all evening once power enters the room. Daniel remained seated beside me, pale and shaken, while Vanessa stood frozen beside him, trying desperately to maintain control over a situation already slipping through her fingers. Chloe looked close to tears. Martin waited calmly with his hands folded over the leather folder containing Richard's final protections. And me? I felt strangely peaceful. Not triumphant. Not angry. Just awake. For years I kept shrinking myself to preserve relationships that were already disappearing. Tonight Richard finally forced me to see that clearly. Daniel looked up at me carefully. Mom, he said quietly, please do not make decisions tonight based on misunderstandings. I almost smiled at that word again. Misunderstandings. Such a soft, harmless word people use when they are afraid to call something what it really is. You seated me beside the kitchen doors, I answered calmly. Daniel opened his mouth immediately. That was Vanessa's. Then he stopped himself too late. Vanessa turned sharply toward him. Excuse me. He rubbed both hands over his face wearily. I am saying tonight got out of control. No, I replied softly. Tonight simply revealed what was already there. Silence followed again. Across the ballroom the wedding band awkwardly transitioned into another song, while guests whispered quietly among themselves. I noticed the young waiter from earlier standing near the service station watching me with open sympathy now. Strange. The people who treated me with the most kindness tonight were complete strangers. Chloe suddenly knelt beside my chair, gathering part of her wedding gown carefully beneath her. Grandma, she whispered emotionally, I swear I did not know any of this. I thought you wanted a quieter table because of the noise and... Her voice broke halfway through the sentence. I touched her cheek gently. I know, sweetheart. And I did know. Chloe had inherited Richard's softness beneath all the influence surrounding her. That softness simply got buried under years of Vanessa controlling every family narrative. Vanessa stepped forward abruptly. Evelyn, if this is about hurt feelings, we can correct the situation immediately. Hurt feelings. The phrase landed colder than any insult earlier that evening. Because even now, after everything, she still believed this was about appearances rather than dignity. I looked directly at her for the first time all night. Do you know what the saddest part is, Vanessa? She crossed her arms defensively but stayed silent. You spent years trying to make me feel small because you thought small people were easier to move out of the way. Her expression hardened immediately. That is not fair. No, I answered softly. What was unfair happened long before tonight. Daniel stood slowly then, his voice quieter than I had heard in years. Dad really changed everything because of this? Martin answered before I could. Your father changed everything because he believed loyalty mattered more than image. Daniel looked toward the dance floor where guests still celebrated beneath crystal lights and flower arrangements his father's money had helped build. Then finally he looked back at me fully. Really looked. I saw it then. The terrible realization settling into him piece by piece. Not just that he might lose financial control. Worse than that. He was beginning to understand how many years he allowed his mother to feel unwanted, while convincing himself nothing serious was happening. "Mom," he whispered hoarsely. "Why did you never say anything?" Tears filled my eyes unexpectedly, but my voice remained steady. Because mothers spend their lives trying not to become burdens to their children. Daniel looked shattered by that answer. Good. Not because I wanted revenge, but because truth should hurt when it arrives too late. Martin checked the documents once more before speaking carefully. "Evelyn, legally the decision is entirely yours now. You may enforce the trust immediately, postpone action, or decline enforcement completely." Every person at that table waited for my answer like their future depended on it. Maybe it did. I looked down at Richard's letter resting in my hands and suddenly remembered our final conversation together during hospice care. His voice weak but calm beside the hospital window. "Promise me something, Evie," he whispered. "When I am gone, do not spend the rest of your life begging people to value you properly." At the time I cried and told him not to talk that way. But he already knew. Richard always saw the truth long before I did. Slowly I stood from table 19. The same forgotten table beside the kitchen doors where they placed me because I no longer matched the image they wanted displayed under ballroom lights. Guests nearby watched openly now. Vanessa straightened nervously. Daniel looked terrified. Chloe clutched my hand tightly. I smoothed the front of my navy blue dress carefully and picked up my purse. Then I handed Martin the envelope and trust papers without looking away from my family. "Enforce everything exactly as Richard intended," I said calmly. Vanessa inhaled sharply. Daniel closed his eyes briefly like a man finally understanding the full cost of his silence. But I was not finished yet. I leaned toward Chloe first and kissed her forehead gently. "Your grandfather loved you very much," I whispered. "Do not let money teach you how to treat people." Then I turned toward Daniel. My son looked older than I had ever seen him. Older even than the day we buried Richard. "You did not lose your inheritance tonight," I said quietly. "You lost your family little by little every time you chose comfort over courage." Nobody spoke after that. They simply watched me walk away from table 19, past the kitchen doors, through the glowing ballroom filled with flowers and music and people who finally noticed me once it was too late. And for the first time in many years, I did not feel invisible anymore.